Back in the late 90s, I was a teen with hopes, dreams, and above all, a love of the wilderness. I got this from my grandpa, who I'm convinced would have become a fully fledged wild mountain man if he hadn't met Grandma, the love of his life, and settled down to become an accountant of all things. I'm told that if you met him in his day job, you would absolutely never have known what kind of guy he was. A short king, average build, shirt and tie, white-collar worker. But as soon as the weekend came, it was like Clark Kent going into the phone booth and coming out as Superman. Grandpa was like a 5'6" Rambo, rippling muscles hidden by his work shirt, a just total transformation. By the time I often went hunting with him, he'd retired from the office job, so I mostly knew outdoor Grandpa, and he was my hero. Me, him, my older sister Jess, and Mom, we'd go hunting often. Grandma and Dad couldn't stomach it, though. Grandma, because she actually hated the killing, and Dad because I swear that man was the worst shot that you'd ever seen in your entire life. In the end, he admitted that he was such a liability that he'd stay home and get ready to prep the meat when we brought any kills in. Many happy family times were spent on hunting trips, but alas, everything comes to an end. Grandma got sick and passed away, Mom and Dad went their separate ways, and it wasn't hugely friendly, so Dad and Grandpa never really spoke again. Jess went off and got married and had a whole family of her own, and Grandpa got old. I stayed close by. I ran a small general store in town, and he actually worked for me in his retirement, just helping where he could, but mostly sitting on a rocker on the porch. The store was doing a good turnover, and it was honestly worth paying Grandpa a wage to just sit outside the store being a local character who greeted customers and shared a tale or two. I honestly think Grandpa was the best friend I ever had. He lived in an assisted living home, and it was one of those where he was free to come and go, but there was staff on hand if he needed anything. I asked him many times to come and live with me and my partner, but he was having none of it. Said that we didn't need an old man stinking up the place with his tobacco smoke and whatnot. And I reminded him that I'd always had a crappy sense of smell and could barely even smell his huge stinking cigars when he smoked those. And he reminded me that my long-suffering partner had perfectly good olfactory senses, and he had a point. Plus, honestly, I think he had a crush on one of the nurses at the assisted living home and didn't want to admit it. One day, when I had a weekend off from the store and so did he, I went to visit him. Grandpa was more cheerful than usual, which was odd considering he was a pretty cheery old fella at the best of times. Seemed in the best of health, in fact. We played cards for a bit, and he was hooting with laughter whenever he won or lost, and eventually I asked him what was up. Something clearly had him down good. When he told me the answer, I was absolutely shell-shocked. I had to stand up and stare out of the window for a moment, and I remember it being a very dreary, rainy day, and that felt almost perfect right then. It was a letter from an oncologist that he'd been seeing, without my knowledge, and I don't remember exactly what it said, but the words brain tumor, inoperable, affairs in order, they're ones that stuck out to me. And I stared out the window for a moment and then turned to him, and I think this was the first time that I ever got angry at the old man. I asked him why he was so damn happy and how he could let me think something good was happening. And he just smiled at me gently and told me that I'd understand when I was his age, which was 82 at this point, that he was finally going to see Grandma again and his daughter. Mom had also sadly passed early by this point, and that knowing the end is coming when you're old isn't scary. It's like knowing you're about to get to the end of a good, satisfying book, and that all things considered, a brain tumor was a pretty quick way to go compared to some forms of cancer. I sat down and thought about it for a while, in silence, and then I looked up at him and I said, "Hey Grandpa, is there anything you want to do before the end, you know?" And then his face lit up like he'd been waiting for me to ask, like this was what made him so happy. Then he told me. He told me that there was one that got away, and that there was a final hunting trip he wanted me to take him on. It wasn't easy. The old man needed a cane to walk at this point, and sometimes even a wheelchair. He refused that for the trip, of course, but we still had to make our way deep into the woods with one of us using a cane. It was extremely, extremely slow going, and what would have previously been a day's hike took us 4 days of stopping to camp, stopping to rest, stopping to talk. And I think that was the point, really. Grandpa just wanted to spend some time with me, away from everything, and it was like chicken soup for the soul for both of us. On day 5, we pitched up camp, and Grandpa said that this was it. This was the spot. He waited till the sun set, and then he sat me down and told me about the one that got away. And it was like a Bigfoot, he said, but it wasn't one. He'd first encountered it years back when my mom was a teenager and they had been hunting together one time. He said at first that he thought it was a werewolf, until we remember werewolves don't appear in broad daylight and Bigfoots do. At this point, I paused to remind him that neither of those things are actually real, and he waved my concerns away. Besides, he said, it was neither of those things anyway. I asked what it was, and he said it didn't have a name. It was like a Wendigo or a skinwalker, but it wasn't those either. He said he called it the Shatterpaw. And I asked him why, and he explained that he'd found footprints that day which looked like an animal's paw if it had been shattered. Hence, it forever became known in his mind as a Shatterpaw. And he then told me that he'd seen the Shatterpaw another 6 or 7 times over the years. It was hunting him, he said, or so he thought. He'd be out with us in the woods, and he'd look over and see the Shatterpaw just standing there in the far distance, watching him. He said he could tell the Shatterpaw wanted him, and it was sending him a clear message, like one he could hear straight into his brain. It wanted him, and one day it would get him. And so he told me this was the last chance to get the Shatterpaw first before it came to him one night and took him to whatever hell it had come from. Of course, my reaction was to very sanely assume that the brain tumor was starting to do its business, and maybe I'd made a big and dramatic mistake by bringing a dying man with a neurological condition out hunting. Something had stopped me even considering this up until that point, and now I felt like an actual lunatic. And so I decided to do the only sensible thing that I could think to do. I acted like I believed Grandpa about the Shatterpaw. We spent the next few hours clumsily, loudly stalking through the woods in pursuit of this creature that I knew didn't exist. I knew it didn't matter if we spooked it away because it wasn't real, and it was like 2 kids play acting, only one of us was a grown-ass man who owned a general store, and the other was an old fellow with a brain tumor who could barely walk. And here was the other thing. I did have a bit of sense in me. Little did Grandpa know, he was carrying a hunting rifle that I'd actually disabled at the store. The firing mechanism simply wouldn't work even if he tried to shoot something, and even without the Shatterpaw, there was no way that I was letting an 82-year-old man with a brain tumor and a cane carry around a deadly weapon. I might be dumb, but I'm not that stupid. Unfortunately, Grandpa was neither, but we'll get to that in a moment. Eventually, the sun set and we cooked burgers over the camp stove and went to bed in our tent for the night. Now, a few hours later, Grandpa woke me up by shaking my shoulder. "Can you smell it?" he said. I couldn't smell a damn thing and told him so. He waved dismissively at me, reminding me how bad my sense of smell was anyway, and then he added this sudden lore to the Shatterpaw that apparently it gives off this really strong stench, but only 10% of the population can smell it, I guess, like how not everyone can smell blood or cyanide. I thought about asking why he hadn't mentioned this earlier, but since it was all fiction, what did it matter? And so I told him that if Shatterpaw was out there, we should stay put. Now Grandpa says, no way, he's out there. Grab your gun, Sonny. We're confronting this beast. And then he was gone, out of the tent before I could say a single thing. And I figured that there was a tiny chance that there was at least some kind of mildly threatening animal out there, or even a person, so I snatched up my rifle. Weirdly, I noticed Grandpa had just left his behind. And when I stepped out of the tent, Grandpa had lit the bonfire. I looked around and asked where the Shatterpaw was, and Grandpa looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I think you know." And that's when he pulled the handgun from his waistband. He told me he'd known all along that I'd sabotage his gun, that he was sorry for stealing from my store, but he needed to be armed, that the real me would thank him if I was still alive somewhere. And then he pointed the revolver at me. His hand shook as he aimed, and tears started coming down his face. "You reek of it, boy," he said. "You always have. It took you one day, and it's been you ever since." What? I'm not the damn Shatterpaw, I told him. You know I'm not. And he denied it. He said it was him or me. He kept talking, and he kept stalling. Said that the only way that I could prove that I wasn't the Shatterpaw was if I shot him in the head, or he'd do it to me. I threw my gun to the ground. Grandpa looked confused and then maybe even a little bit ashamed. I told him I knew what he was doing, and that he wanted to go out on his own terms, and that this was the best damn plan that he could think of. He was a die-hard Christian, so ending it all wasn't an option, and if I shot him believing it was life or death, I could forgive myself. I asked him if that was right, and he nodded as he lowered the gun. A big part of me wanted to be mad. How could my beloved grandpa try tricking me into killing him? But then I realized, to him, he was putting his fate in the hands of the person he loved and trusted the most, and in his aging, decaying brain, he'd somehow justified it. I told him this isn't the way, and he nodded again. I took a step forward to embrace him and take the gun away from him. Everything happened at once. I heard a sound and saw Grandpa raise the pistol. Honest to God, I thought that he changed his mind and was about to shoot me. Instead, he yelled, "Get down," and I dived to the left like my life depended on it. The gun went off with 3 cracks, and I heard the sound of a body hitting the floor. I rolled over to look, and out of everything in the story, this is the most unbelievable part, I know, but this happened. It wasn't a Shatterclaw or a Bigfoot or a Wendigo or a Skinwalker, but while we'd been talking, a mother effing cougar had been creeping up on us and eventually was poised to leap on me just as Grandpa noticed it. And heck, the old man had put the creature down with the first shot, we actually think, right between the eyes. Brain tumor and palsied hands and everything. Well, there was no way that we were leaving proof of that kill behind, the greatest of Grandpa's career, and it took us 5 days to hike back with that dead mountain lion tied up in a sleeping bag. The extra days left us having to ration, and by the time we got back to town, Grandpa wasn't doing great. He'd actually started to develop a lung infection. Things declined pretty quickly after that, but he lived long enough to see that goddamn mountain lion taxidermied and displayed in my store, along with a plaque explaining some of the story. It's not there anymore, as I donated it to a museum about 10 years ago now in the honor of the old man, but I still have photos somewhere from the days before digital. Grandpa passed away in his sleep a couple of months after our camping trip, and I won't say that things went easy because cancer never lets you. But he went gracefully, and to this dying day, he would admit to me that the whole Shatterpaw nonsense of the creature secretly being me was something that he'd gotten from a TV show that he watched in the rec room. But there's one thing that he swore until his passing, and I cannot tell if he believed this because Grandpa was one hell of a joker. But he swears he didn't make up the Shatterpaw itself, and he didn't make up that very first sighting of the creature. And whenever I try to look it up, I can't find a single piece of evidence of a cryptid called a Shatterpaw, so maybe Grandpa really did see one and named it. I think he'd kind of love that as a legacy, so if anyone out there comes across this mythical Shatterpaw, please let me know, so I can let it know that it made an old man very happy in his last days. Back in the 90s, myself and a couple of girlfriends used to go wilderness hiking. We were extremely into it, kind of our whole personalities. I loved it and so did the others, Sarah and Ashley, and we decided to go on a 2-day exploration. We drove as deep into the woods as we could and decided to just spend the day there and then camp there overnight. We parked on a dirt road and hiked until midday, then settled down for some food. Now, keen to get going, we ate a little bit and then began to explore the area. We'd never been here before. It was kind of an odd location. It was very deep into the woods, but the dirt track had allowed us to drive down here fairly easily. Ashley was a photographer, and she had some kind of fancy camera that she used to take nature photos. Now, this was before the days of digital cameras and camera phones, of course, so she had to be kind of picky about what she snapped. And that's what drew my attention. 1, 2, 3 photos almost in a row. I looked over to where Ashley was, and she was standing near a rock face. I couldn't tell what she'd seen, so I angled around and realized that hiding behind this curtain of vines was a cave. She'd been using her flash to light up the interior of that cave before going in. Sarah chastised her in case it was some bear's den, but pointed out that bears hadn't been active in that area since probably way back in the 70s. It was a pretty safe area this far deep into the woods. Ashley said that this may be so, but something had clearly been using the cave as its lair a long time ago. We could tell it was abandoned though because there were some rocks covering the entrance which we had to clamber over to get inside. Now this curtain of vines had fell over the entrance and almost no natural light filled the cave. Sarah and I turned our flashlights on and we looked around. Now it definitely had been some type of animal's lair once. There were very old remains littered in one corner, and then the dry, dusty, musky smell gave it an almost comforting feel. I could imagine a cartoon bear holed up there with its cute little cubs. Now we explored the cave. It was actually pretty small and had a fire pit in the center. People had clearly used it as a camping spot at some point, which made sense given the slight hole in the roof and the fact that the entrance clearly used to be bigger. Sarah joked that it would be a great place for hotboxing, and I just rolled my eyes. We did decide to camp in the cave, though. It meant that we didn't have to bother setting up the tent, and even if it rained, it was sheltered enough that if we stuck towards the back, we'd be completely sheltered. So we explored some more in the daylight, and then at night, and we settled down. We decided to cook on our stove outside the cave rather than risk filling the constricted area with smoke. It had clearly been a more open hidey hole the last time the fire pit had been used. We had a good dinner, and then went into the cave to bunk down for the night. We were woken up by the mother of all storms, though. Nowhere in the weather reports had it suggested anything like this. It was like Mother Nature had just turned on us. Thunder, followed immediately by lightning, and I could thank the Lord that we were camping inside a cave instead of outside in a tent. That is until I heard a crack, a crash, and a rumbling. I flicked my flashlight on in the direction of the noise and watched in absolute horror as a rain of rocks fell down over the cave entrance. Immediately, the meager moonlight was almost drowned out, with the only light coming in from the hole in the ceiling, which was a good 15 feet high, if not more. With nothing else we could really do in the middle of the night during a thunderstorm to end all storms, we tried to sleep. The next day we woke up fractious, sleep-deprived, and snippy at each other. And this only worsened as we each had to pee in the back of the cave, which left a fairly unpleasant atmosphere. And then things got even worse as we tried to move the rocks from the entrance, only to realize that they were far too heavy for us to move from the inside, not to mention rain slicked, and we decided to sit down and just have some breakfast, lit by the meager sunlight that came in through the tiny gap in the cave ceiling. I hoped that our hunger abated and things would eventually calm down. I was messing with the rocks when I heard Sarah and Ashley begin whisper arguing behind me. They'd been at each other's throats all vacation, which wasn't hugely unusual, so I tried ignoring it. It was one of those situations where we all shared a strong passion for exploring the woods, and they were both my friends, so they were kind of friends with each other by proxy. The whisper arguing turned into raised voices arguing, though, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Ashley was accusing Sarah of having an affair with her partner, and now Ashley had a tendency to be kind of paranoid when it came to her partner Tyler, and for good reason. He had cheated on her a number of times, and sometimes I wanted to shake her and say just leave him, but she wasn't having any of it. Now they were soulmates, even if in my opinion soulmates didn't typically screw other people. Now, though, it sounded like Ashley at least was convinced Tyler had actually screwed Sarah. And of course, this couldn't be true, though, as Tyler barely knew her, right? I expected Sarah to defend herself, and instead, she accused Ashley of being unable to please her man, so what did she expect when he ended up in another woman's bed? I stepped in at this point and just asked straight up, "Sarah, did you sleep with Tyler?" And she looked at me, and in the dim light of the cave, this look of shame on her face was very damning. And then she hardened up, just straight up confessed to it, stared Ashley down and told her that she'd done it with Tyler not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then, For whatever insane reason, she added that she'd let Tyler do things to her that Ashley was just too much of a prude to let him do. So maybe she should learn how to please her man a little more. And it kind of struck me weirdly at that moment that Sarah was a smoker, and I hadn't seen her smoke a cigarette since we'd holed up in that cave. Weirdly thoughtful, considering that she was out here ruining Ashley's confidence and life. I went to suggest that maybe she would light up and calm down, but then something even more insane happened. Ashley, calm, meek Ashley, who was kind of a pushover, full body charged Sarah and slammed her into the ground. Then the pair were fighting, pulling hair, yelling and screeching so loud it echoed around the cave. In the end, this crazy catfight is what actually saved us, because a loud, deep male voice yelled down from the hole in the ceiling, asking what in the damn hell we were doing in there, yelling loud enough to wake the dead. I looked up, squinting against the sunlight, and I could have sworn the guy looking down at us was a member of ZZ Top. One of them with a beard, anyway. And I'd never seen a hairier man with a bigger, whiter beard. It was like Gandalf. And he looked like an absolute definition of a wilderness survival mountain man, which I later found out is exactly what he was. I shouted up that we'd been trapped in the cave due to a rock slide, and that we couldn't shift the rocks from inside the cave. He yelled back that he'd climb on down and see what he could do from the outside. You would think that this would have calmed Sarah and Ashley down, but no. They were still screaming at each other, trading slaps, and at one point Sarah, the one who'd boned Ashley's man, grabbed a rock and was threatening to smack Ashley in the head with it. I heard noise above us, and then the sound of clattering rocks and masculine straining grunts. I don't know how to describe this any better than this. Imagine a mountain man doing a very strenuous activity. And if you select to read this story, please try doing this as a sound effect for me. Just me, though. Thank you. Finally, a medium-sized boulder popped into the cave and light came spilling in. The mountain man looked in, and now I could see that his beard was even bigger than I previously thought, and he also had one blind eye and somewhat of a scar, and goddamn if this dude wasn't the most badass man I'd ever seen in my life. It was almost terrifying. And then he got real scary. Sarah and Ashley were still screaming at each other, and Sarah had that rock in her hand. It was like they hadn't even noticed the mountain man trying to rescue us. So we hollered. Folion screamed and yelled that if you gals don't shut your harpy yapping and quit disturbing the peace, then he'll skin all of us like the 500-pound black bear that he took down just last week. Quote unquote. I guess he saw the fear on my face as I turned to stare at him, because he gave me a wink and a little smile and gestured to the other two who had finally shut up and stopped arguing. With the mountain man's help from the other side, we were able to clear enough of a gap into the rock slide to allow us to climb through. Sarah, the largest of the group, was last to come through, and I honestly can't blame Ashley for refusing to help her, so it fell to me and the mountain man. Sarah and Ashley were still staring daggers at each other. The mountain man, who said his name was Bob, told us that he was going to take off and to drive safe now and maybe drop by the local hospital to check on the scrapes and bruises we'd gotten, especially Ashley and Sarah in their little fight. I just about begged the mountain man to ride with us. I genuinely honestly didn't feel safe with Ashley and Sarah, especially since I was the driver, and if a fight had broken out while I was trying to drive, I was so exhausted that I'm not sure that I could have kept the car on the road. I guess Bob sympathized with me because he eventually agreed, and even though he said he didn't like to go into town much, his one condition, though, was that he was riding shotgun with me. No way was he sitting in the back with either of those crazy chicks. Fair enough. If you can picture Sarah and Ashley's anger as being enough to scare the toughest-looking elderly mountain man I've ever met, and likely ever will meet, you can probably imagine how icy the environment was. We drove the hour or so into town and went to the small walk-in clinic to get checked out. It turned out that Ashley had some kind of infection that she'd gotten from a cut and was actually suffering from dehydration, so she had to stay overnight. I stayed with Ashley, and Sarah decided to take a bus back to the city. I think it was the last time they ever spoke. And as a funny epilogue, Ashley decided not to tell Tyler that she knew he'd cheated on her. Instead, she called him up and explained what had happened. A couple of hours later, he showed up at the hospital. It was me, Bob, and Tyler in the room with Ashley in the bed. She tried to climb out of the bed, and Tyler thought that she was going to hug him or something. Bob knew different, though. He put a hand on Ashley's shoulder and told him he had this. And then he walked up to Tyler, moved as if to shake his hand, and then gave him a backhand pimp slap that was firm enough to undermine Tyler's masculinity, but not enough to do any damage. That's the kind of man Bob was, though. When Tyler looked stunned, Bob told him that maybe next time he'd think twice about treating a fine girl like Ashley the way he had. And I kid you not, Tyler's response was, "Which time are you talking about?" And I think that's when Ashley finally decided enough was enough, and from the way Bob looked at Tyler, I think Tyler knew it too. He turned around, threw the flowers that he'd brought for Ashley in the trash, and we just never saw that fool again. The only way to stay in touch with Bob, who lived off the grid, was to give him my mailing address. And I realized that in modern day it'd probably be considered a bad idea to give a wild mountain man your home address, but Bob actually sent me a Christmas card every year for the next 8 years. Eventually, I received a letter from Bob's grandson, who sadly informed me that he'd passed away, but that Bob kept daily journals and an address book, and I was marked in there as highly important as a person to send a Christmas card to, which touched my heart in ways I can't even begin to express. And the only way for this story to become more of a fairy tale is if Bob's grandson, who wrote me and was around the same age as me, had met up with me in the city and we'd hit it off and eventually become a couple. But I guess I'll just leave it to you guys to decide whether that part actually happened, as it's probably too far-fetched to be true, so I'm not going to confirm either way. But I will let you know one thing. My firstborn son, who's a teenager now, is called Robert, and he has a strong love for the outdoors. I thought my ex-boyfriend was a great guy. I really did. So much so that I was willing to let him talk me into going deep into the woods hiking with him. I've never been a real outdoorsy girl, much less a go into the middle of nowhere with one other person girl. So yeah, I really trusted and loved this guy. But they say if you really wanted to get to know a partner, go on vacation with them. Well, I'll also add, go on vacation with them into the deep woods. That really shows what kind of person they are, like a complete and utter maniac, for example. We spent a lot of time preparing for the trip, days of discussing it, planning our route. Maybe I should have seen it as a red flag when my ex, we'll call him Aaron, bought all this brand new navigational equipment, including an expensive compass, satellite GPS locator, etc., despite telling me that he'd hiked these woods dozens of times and was a quote-unquote expert on the area. On the drive down, he talked incessantly about how beautiful the area was, how dangerous it could be too. And that's why we were doing a short day hike on the first day, and then spending a day in a nearby motel, having fun in his words. And then on day 3, we'd come back for a 2-night camping trip in the same woods. Aaron was right about one thing. These woods were absolutely stunning. Summer was turning into fall and the colors were breathtaking. I dabble with acrylic painting in my spare time, so really all I wished was that I'd brought some paint and an easel and could set up in the parking lot to paint some of the more beautiful foliage. I said this to Aaron, and he sort of glared at me and implied that I was afraid to hike through the woods. Now, I thought he was joking, maybe teasing, and even so, my female pride kicked in, and I responded, "Yeah, I'm gonna show you, buddy." And I snatched up my pack and told him to catch me if he could. Now, this was fun for a bit. Leading him through the woods was almost romantic. And then he caught me, and it led to a bit of a makeout session, and I let him take over leading the way. And the scenario was kind of beautiful, you know? The day was so perfect that I didn't remotely let it concern me that there had been no trail markers or anything. Aaron knew this place like the back of his hand after all, so there was nothing to worry about, right? So we took a break for lunch. These pretty much just gas station snacks and all that kind of stuff. And then I took a roll of toilet paper out of my backpack and started to go off into the woods to pee. Aaron looked at me like I was a maniac and asked what I was doing. I explained that I had to go pee, and he acted like it was the grossest thing in the world, peeing outdoors, but also remarked that it was really smart of me to bring toilet paper with us. Isn't that common knowledge? And how did he expect to use the bathroom himself, especially on our later 3-day camping trip? I asked him this, and he brushed it off like it was a joke, but I got the impression that he hadn't even thought about it. This was a red flag, because surely a guy who'd engaged in all this wilderness hiking would know that it was necessary to at least take a piss in the woods. And he was a guy. All he had to do was whip it out and spray. I tried to convince myself that that was it, that maybe he didn't have that much experience with women. We were in our early 20s, and I don't know, maybe he somehow thought that someone with girl parts could just hold it in for that long. God knows why I let it go though, but I did. And when I returned, Aaron had packed up our things and was pretty raring to go. Based on the time and how long we'd been out, I figured that we would have probably started heading back to the car now. And when I suggested this to Aaron, he then responds, "Yeah, guess we should do that soon. I mean, I was thinking we could start heading back when it got dark, but..." Now, I was baffled. We couldn't be hiking through the deep woods in the pitch darkness, even with those X-Files level flashlights that we brought with us just in case. In that case, we might as well have planned to camp out overnight. I told him this, and he got very huffy and puffy and moody and said, fine, we just head back, and then started storming off completely in the wrong direction. Now, I'm not some expert navigator, but even I could tell that we were heading deeper into the forest. Now, I quietly suggested this a couple of times, and each time he got more and more angry, to the point that I started to genuinely feel a little unsafe around him. It was a side of him that I'd never seen before. I tried to chalk it up to maybe heat stroke or allergies or I don't know what. I kept asking him if he needed some water because I could tell that he was getting overheated. Eventually, he just snatched the bottle from me and took this huge gulp, allowing a bunch of water to spill all over the ground. And again, hardly something that a seasoned survivalist would probably do. And eventually I had had enough. It was almost 3 p.m. and we were clearly heading even further from the car. I stopped and kinda did that hands on my hips angry girl pose, saying, "Bro, admit it, we're lost," I said. Not sure that I called him bro, but I had an affectionate pet name for him, but it's really icky to think about now. And he insisted that we were not lost, and hadn't I been listening to a word he said? And he was a seasoned hiker, and of course he knew that the sun would be setting soon. We were nearly back to the parking lot. I asked him to look at the GPS tracker that we'd spent so much on, so he just grumbles and says fine, and then takes the box out of his backpack. The sealed box. He hadn't even set it up or charged it or anything. He just brought the damn GPS tracker and somehow expected it to just work. And when I pointed this out, he almost threw the damn thing in a rage. I had to grab his arm and stop him from hurling it into the woods. Jesus. And I realized that maybe Aaron had a temper on him that I'd never seen before. I was out here in the absolute middle of nowhere with this guy, and he was quickly revealing himself not to be the guy that I thought he was. Very calmly and quietly, I suggested that maybe we check the map out and try to work out our location and piece things together using landmarks and the compass. I really wasn't being accusatory or belittling at all. But of course, little did I know just how much this was all insulting his pride, so I did not expect him to react the way in which he did. Aaron began screaming at me, calling me terrible things, all types of derogatory insults about how stupid and demanding and ridiculous I was being. And then finally he ended the rant by calling me an ungrateful C-word, which, wow, I've never been called that by someone who wasn't some catcaller or a stranger in my life. And even then I was prepared to forgive him if he immediately apologized. But no. He said if I knew best, that it would be better for me to find my own way back, and he'd wait for me in the car. Because obviously in his mind there was no chance that I'd get back before him. And then he storms off into the forest, in clearly the wrong direction, while screaming one final F you over his shoulder to me. Up until that point, I'd still been considering reminding him that I had the keys to the car. But at that point, I said nah, screw him. I took a few minutes to gather myself, had a little bit of a cry and ate a granola bar, and then I put myself together and headed in the direction that I was certain that we'd come from. I walked for about half an hour, recognizing landmarks and even a twig that I'd snapped from earlier. I felt like I was doing pretty well, feeling confident and almost smug about the situation. And then I heard the sound of branches cracking somewhere behind me, and a voice. A high, mocking redneck voice, like the kind of cliche backwoods killer that you hear in some crappy horror movie. "You done effed up, girlie." "You done come into our part of the woods." Something like that anyway. And I didn't even wait. I just began to run. Now, stupidly, my first thought was that I'd hoped Aaron was safe and that whoever this was hadn't got to him first. I had to be careful, though, not to head off the beaten track and still make sure that I was going in the right direction. Now, I could hear this unseen hillbilly pursuing me. He was running, somewhere behind me and up the hill among the trees. Occasionally, he'd hoot out some kind of threat, like, "I'm gonna skin your pretty little butt," or "That chest is looking real good mounted on a cabin wall." Psychotic things like that. And what followed was a chase worthy of a movie, or so it felt to me at the time. I was darting this way and that way through the trees, occasionally hearing this pursuer. Now in my head, I was picturing him as some kind of mix between Jason Voorhees and The Undertaker from WWE, even though he had a kind of high-pitched nasally voice, more like that one guy from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a movie that I'd actually watched with Aaron just a week or so before this, stupidly. Now I found a hollowed-out tree stump and ducked into it, deciding to listen for this murderous hillbilly. I could hear him, but he seemed pretty far away now, and he was yelling something about inserting something that I don't want to repeat into my mouth. I started to feel throw-up rise in my throat, imagining this filthy inbred monster doing all this awful stuff to me. I decided to use stealth from here on in. He was yelling about how he could see me, but from the positioning of his voice, I was pretty sure that wasn't true. I snuck through the trees, as silently as I could, and he was being pretty silent too. And then, creeping through the undergrowth, I saw a figure with its back to me, peeking from behind a tree. I almost called out and ran over there, but then the figure called out, "Where are you, little piggy? Piggy, pig, pig, I'm gonna put you on my spit roast." The voice had definitely come from the man peering around the tree, only the man was no redneck hillbilly monster. It was freaking Aaron. And then suddenly it dawned on me. Aaron acted all macho, but he'd later been a theater kid in college. One of his buddies had told me, and this absolute lunatic had been following me through the woods, trying to put the fear of God into me by play acting as some murderous hillbilly. The problem I still had, though, was that I had no idea how fake the murderous part was. I had three choices: sneak past him, confront him angrily, or treat him like a potential murderer and, I don't know, knock him out with a rock or something. I decided to go for a fourth option. I found a small rock on the ground and threw it as far as I could in the direction that Aaron was looking, and this dumbass fell for it like some crappy video game NPC. He started off in the direction of the sound, and I ran an almost crouch-walking way away from the location. Now, 10 minutes later, I spotted a huge, gnarled tree that I recognized from the beginning of our hike, because I'd so desperately wanted to paint. Another 5 minutes, and thank the Lord, I was back to the parking lot. I got into my car, and genuinely, honestly considered just driving off and leaving him there. But I figured the chances of the dumbass getting himself killed were pretty high, and I didn't want his death on my conscience. Plus, I wanted to find out whether he'd own up to it. I kept a small licensed revolver in my glove compartment that Aaron didn't know about. I stashed it on my lap under my purse and then hammered on the horn repeatedly, trying to guide him to the car. 10 minutes later, Aaron comes out of the trees looking embarrassed but still a little smug. And when he got into the car, I quickly started the engine and began to drive off. He didn't really say much, but when we were on the road, I eventually told him that the most terrifying thing had just happened to me, and that some cannibal redneck killer had stalked me through the woods, and I told him that I genuinely thought that I was going to die. "Do you sound a bit like this?" he asked, putting that voice on. Now I pretended to be shocked, like, "You heard him too?" And then Aaron began hooting and hollering with laughter, saying, No, it was him the whole time. Remember, he's an actor. Wasn't it hilarious?" I stared ahead at the road as I asked him if he really didn't intend to kill me. In his defense, he acted horrified, like he was simply too much of an ignorant, arrogant idiot to even consider the fact that it could have traumatized me. And we drove for a while in silence. He kept asking me if I was mad, and I think he knew that he screwed up. Eventually, we reached a gas station in a somewhat suburban area. It had a diner and a truck stop, and I checked, and I had cell phone reception. I told Aaron that I'd consider forgiving him if he went into the gas station and bought me a gas station hot dog. And then I waited until he was halfway through the gas station door, and then peeled out of that parking lot and did not stop driving for another hour. When I pulled into the next rest stop, I had dozens of texts from him. First they were apologies, then they got madder and madder, telling me that I was some stuck-up C-word and that I better come back and get him right now. I texted him back telling him to call an Uber or, better yet, hitch a ride with one of the truckers at the truck stop, and just hope that they weren't a cannibal redneck serial killer. Then I blocked him, and I never heard from that idiot again. I did check on Facebook to be sure that he'd gotten home safely, and he had. Hilariously, the post that I saw was actually kind of contrite, about how he'd done a terrible thing to a person that he loved and blah blah blah. Somehow most of the comments seemed to assume that he'd done something a lot worse, and a whole argument had broken out about him being a POS. I almost cracked then and posted to answer their burning questions of what he'd done, but I decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Absolutely the weirdest vacation I've ever had, the weirdest guy I ever dated, and thankfully the weirdest scary story I have to share at parties. Now I hope you enjoy the tale of the time that I wasn't stalked by a cannibal killer. Me and my buddy Mikey used to go deep into the woods on a hiking exploration trip every few months. We still go, just not as often anymore, and that's at least partly because of the story that I'm about to share with you all. And it's about a time that we didn't get killed by a guy who wasn't Corey Feldman. Now yeah, I know pretty much everyone has a story about a time that they didn't get murdered, and as far as I know, Corey Feldman has never killed a guy either. But trust me when I say that this is the absolute best way of explaining what the story's about. Cutting out all the BS preamble that drives me nuts, I'm going to start the story with me and Mikey 2 days into our hike, sitting around the campfire frying up some meat. We weren't out in the wilderness to hunt, just explore and have fun, and we knew our crap and knew situational awareness and being mindful of our surroundings and all of that stuff, obviously, which is why we were a little surprised when, seated at our campfire, a voice spoke from directly behind us saying, "Hey guys, what's up?" We both kind of jumped and turned around in our seats. And you could tell that this fella was hoping for that reaction because he had this little grin on his face. That was surreal enough. But what made it even more surreal was that the man standing before us looked like Corey Feldman, the child star of The Goonies, Lost Boys, Friday the 13th Part 3, and more. I would have sworn on the Bible that this was the case. Corey Feldman, looking exactly like Corey Feldman would look in the late 2000s, but wearing those thick glasses he often wore as a child star. He was dressed in one of those military jackets that you could get in just about every store back in the 2000s and some camo khakis. He had a green military-style cap on too. And I remember all this because, let me stress, I was 100% sure that I was looking at Corey Feldman. And when he took another step towards the campfire, I saw that he was not, in fact, Corey Feldman, because I happen to know that Corey Feldman is a pretty short guy, 5'3" or 5'4", and this guy was clearly a fair few inches taller than that dude. And he also had this little scar on his cheek that Corey Feldman does not have. But beyond that, if I'd been asked to pick this guy out in a lineup, I would have put the DVD of Stand By Me in the player. Now, trying not to let the guy know that he'd startled us, me and Mikey were saying something like, "Hey bud, how's it going? You out hunting? How's the game?" You know, those sort of questions. He said his name was Bucky to his friends. And before we even had a chance to invite him, Buck sat at a campfire and helped himself to a steak off the damn grill. "Want a beer too, Bucky?" Mikey asked, and Buck replied that his name was Buck, not Bucky. And I wasn't sure if he was joking or if he was trying to make a strong point to say, "Yeah, we're not friends, so you can't call me that," but the dude was chowing down on our goddamn steak, so in my eyes, they gave us the right to call him whatever we damn well pleased. Feeling a little impolite at his rudeness, I asked him how often people called him Corey, and he stared at me through those thick glasses and was kind of saying, "Huh? Corey? What are you talking about?" And I waited for him to laugh, but it never came. I told him not to worry about it, but he just pushed, and I had to ignore Mikey's stifling giggles as I was forced to say, "Well, buddy, you kind of look like the actor Corey Feldman." But Buck just stared at me. And then he says, "Don't you mean Adam Sandler?" "What?" And then he went on to claim that everyone always compared him to Adam Sandler, that he looked like the guy. And I'm sure most of you know this, but Adam Sandler and Corey Feldman do not look a thing alike, and this guy did not look like Adam freaking Sandler. I shot Mikey a look, is this guy yanking our chains, and Mikey was no help. But he just sort of girlishly was giggling behind his hand. "Yeah," Buck said, "people say that I look like Adam Sandler, but my friends call me Kyle." "Wait, what?" And I thought this guy's friends called him Bucky, and this got more confusing by the minute. He explained they call him Kyle, after Chris Kyle, the American Sniper dude. But he doesn't like being called Kyle because he makes that guy look like a baby. Buck apparently was a trained sniper, and he told us about some of his best shots. I can't remember, and I can't be bothered to recount it, but the exact details of these claims, but let's just say that as someone with even a passing interest in long-range rifles and snipers who comes from a military family, you would have to be the most talented marksman to ever exist in order to pull off some of the shots that Buck was claiming, to the point that some of them were not humanly possible. Apparently, he stayed prone for over 3 days without eating and drinking and using the bathroom, just to avoid shooting a woman who was in the way of his target, a Taliban leader. Mikey, who was getting a bit drunk at this point, asked why the woman and the Taliban leader were having a 3-day conversation in the first place, and Buck looked at him like he wanted to bite his eyes out. Genuine, absolute fury at being questioned. It was enough to sober Mikey up, and let me tell you, that's no mean feat. The problem is, sober, insulted Mikey is a lot more confrontational than drunk, mocking Mikey. So when Buck told his next story, some elaborate yarn about ricocheting a bullet off of 3 different metal surfaces and saving a pregnant woman from a rogue American general who was clearly meant to be Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now, Mikey called BS. Like literally he just said BS, and then started humming Ride of the Valkyries. Buck stood up fast and began to reach into the waistband of his pants. Both of us leapt to our feet, and within seconds, I had my own pistol trained on him. I don't drink, unlike Mikey, and I do carry. I'm the designated don't F with us guy when we go hiking because you'd be surprised how many times you'd need one of those. Now Buck says, Hey, steady on, guys. We got a couple of wannabe soldiers on our hands, huh?" Excuse me, buddy. You were the one who was seemingly just reaching for a gun." Buck then says that he could tell that he wasn't wanted, but that maybe we'd better watch out, because he owned this land, he didn't, and had every right to shoot us, he didn't. And then Bucky stormed off into the trees, never to be seen again, by us anyway. Now the next day we packed up and continued our hike. We were just walking along chatting when suddenly out of nowhere we hear a crack, and a bullet hitting a tree about 20 feet away from us. Mikey and I are both like, what the crap? Is some hunter taking pot shots? And the idea that it was Buck for some reason didn't even occur to us. And so we call out, saying, "Hey buddy, careful over here." And we're wearing these very high-vis jackets, all that good stuff, and then another shot rings out, and we can see it hit almost exactly where the first bullet had. Mikey and I drop to the ground, run behind a tree out of line of sight of the shooter, and try to scour our surroundings. There's no sign of anyone, and we both whisper, "Bucky," at the same time. But it couldn't be. Those shots were accurate. Well, the second one was anyway. And we have a whispered conversation, shocked that maybe Buck was actually telling the truth, at least to some extent. He was an absolute crack shot, even if he was a crackpot. But what the hell could we do? There was no sign of him anywhere, and we're just sort of sitting ducks out here. I decided to put something to the test. I grabbed something out of my pack, a water bottle or something, and tossed it out into the open. The shooter fired, and it blew out of the air. This was a serious, genuine pro. And based on the directions the shots were coming from and the size of the tree that we were hiding behind, I knew that we were somewhat safe. So I called out, "Hey, Buck, buddy, you're not trying to hurt us, are you?" There was no reply. Silence. and then another gunshot, causing bark to explode from the same tree he'd shot at before. Now maybe this was my inner optimist, but I took that as a no. Meanwhile, Mikey says screw this, and decided to run from one point of cover to another. My heart basically stopped. A shot rang out, and I expected to see my buddy crumple, but no, he made it to safety. And instead, the shooter had hit the tree Mikey was aiming to hide behind. He was toying with us, and it was some kind of sick game. We ditched all of our equipment so we could move light. All we brought was enough water to last us the day or so that it would take to get back to the truck. We figured if we really pushed ourselves, we could make it without stopping. Now the whole journey back, the shooter was taking pot shots at us, but shots designed to prove that he was a cracked marksman. He'd shoot at this thin branch off of a tree, and then he'd land a shot directly in the whirl of some trunk. And it was honestly uncanny, and I'm almost starting to believe that that Buck guy was actually capable of the feats that he'd claimed. The marksmanship that he was displaying was insane, and not once did we see the damn guy. He'd been dressed in basic civilian military gear, sure, but not full camo, and besides, to stay hidden in the forest, he would have needed to change outfits at certain points, and it was like he was a goddamn chameleon, which I guess did fit with what Buck claimed. Eventually, after 22 hours of solid running and crouching and ducking, because who could tell if the shooter would finally decide to stop toying with us and finish us off, we saw the parking lot. The truck appeared, thankfully undamaged, and I say, Mikey, you did take the keys out of your backpack before you ditched it, right? And it says something about the type of terror we felt that he didn't even try joking that he'd left them behind. I had no idea if Buck was still watching us. Maybe he wanted us to get to the truck, think we were safe, and take us both out there and then. We waited for 5 and then 10 minutes, and then that familiar crack sounded, but it was far away and in a different direction. I can't explain how, but somehow it was almost like he was telling us that we were safe to go. We got into the truck, and before I got in, I noticed something resting on the windshield. It was a spent cartridge that I later discovered was some kind of Winchester cartridge. It had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up careful as I could in my gloved hand and slipped it into a Ziploc bag that I had in the truck, and then we drove to the nearest town and obviously went to the damn sheriff's office. The sheriff himself was on duty, thankfully, and I guess it was a quiet day as usual, because he came out to meet us personally. We told him everything, and about how we'd met this guy who seemed okay at first, but then became more threatening, and how the next day he began taking extremely accurate yet intentionally avoidant pot shots at us. And the sheriff nodded his head, almost sagely and wisely, and we got the impression that maybe Buck was some sort of local character, and we were about to hear some wild tale. The sheriff asked us to describe the guy that we were talking about, and obviously we both said that he looked like Corey Feldman, kind of thick glasses, bragged about being a sniper, full of crap, and absolutely definitely looked like Corey. Now the sheriff asked us if he told us his name was Buck, and we said yeah, expecting him to nod and explain that Buck was some kind of veteran with PTSD, Rambo type or something like that, and we waited for his response. And instead of looking assured, the sheriff's face went white. He asked us to come with him and led us to the holding cells at the back of the station. He asked us if this was the guy that we'd met. Now sure enough, Corey Buck Feldman sat on the cell bed looking dejected and very hungover. So much so that even when he saw us, he perked up a little bit and acted like we were his buddies, here to get him out of there. I went to say something like, maybe you shouldn't have tried to kill us, when the sheriff interrupted me. Now the night that we met Buck, he came driving into town, blind drunk, and got pulled over for a DUI, and then he'd been locked up in the drunk tank ever since. Whoever had been taking these warning shots at us was not Buck. We handed the bullet casing over to the sheriff, but Buck shamefully admitted that he'd put that on our windshield even, so that clearly wasn't a clue. The sheriff promised to send a team out to investigate, but we had very little in the way of actual evidence, just a blow-by-blow account of a guy who absolutely could have killed us, but didn't. And when we tell that story back now, we call him The End. If you ever played Metal Gear Solid back in the day, that's kind of how we pictured him. Just some insane, super old dude sitting in the woods with his pet parrot, protecting his land from interlopers like us. He was never found, of course, The woods were a hunting ground. Bullet holes and bullet casings and bullet residue was all over the damn place. Buck seemed especially focused on wanting to help, and I think he was actually affronted that there was an actual sniper in town who was quote-unquote better than him. Weirdly, for some reason I let Buck give us his email, and we've stayed in touch over the years. He's still a complete oddball, what they call a conspiracy head, and his latest thing is that he's a victim of some kind of covert surveillance. But surprisingly, he's good for a beer or two if you're ever down in the vicinity, which, despite our run-in with the Phantom Sniper, sometimes Mikey and I still are. We don't go to that area of the woods. Maybe the sniper's sitting there in his wheelchair, dead of old age like that Metal Gear Solid guy. Maybe he's just blowing off steam between some CIA Black Ops mission because goddamn. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel that's popping off. It's called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't let Dr. Sus steal your innards.